The air in the little cafe was thick with the scent of burnt espresso and frying bacon. Muffled conversations buzzed through the room, punctuated by the clinking of cups against saucers and the occasional burst of laughter. The worn-out ceiling fans spun slowly, casting half-hearted breezes across the tables. It was the kind of place where time seemed to settle like dust, where the scent of old coffee grounds and memories of faded dreams clung to the walls. Amelia leaned against the counter, her fingers absently tracing patterns in a puddle of spilled milk. She had just turned 22, but her eyes, deep brown and weary, held a weight that made her seem older. Her dark hair was tied back in a messy bun, strands falling loose to frame a face that was once soft with hope, now hardened by long shifts and longer nights. This cafe had been her life for the past 3 years. The same cracked tiles underfoot, the same chipped mugs in her hands, the same kind of people passing through day after day. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the rent for her tiny apartment, kept her fridge half full, and left just enough for the occasional splurge on cheap novels or second-hand clothes. She exhaled slowly, glancing at the clock. 2 more hours before her shift ended. 2 more hours of smiles that didn't reach her eyes and polite banter that left her feeling hollow. She longed for something more, something else, though she didn't know what that might be. The bell above the door jingled, snapping her from her thoughts. She looked up, a polite greeting forming on her lips, but the words caught in her throat. He had returned. The man who seemed to carry the world's confidence in the set of his shoulders, the gleam of wealth in his watch and cufflinks, the sharp lines of his perfectly tailored suit. He walked in like he owned the place, and with a twist of dread in her gut, Amelia realized that maybe one day he just might. His name was Thomas Blackwood. She knew this only because he insisted she use it every time he ordered a drink. He was rich, that much was obvious. The kind of rich that came with sleek black cars parked outside and cologne that smelled of mahogany and quiet power. He was always polite, his voice a smooth baritone, but there was an edge behind his eyes, an intensity that made her uneasy. "Good morning, Amelia," he said, sliding onto his usual stool at the counter. His smile was charming, practiced. "How's your day going?" She forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Same as always. The usual coffee for you?" He chuckled softly, a sound that seemed to vibrate through the air. "You know me too well." As she poured his coffee, the silence stretched between them, heavy and uncomfortable. She felt his gaze on her, lingering like a shadow. He'd been coming here for weeks now, always sitting in the same spot, always striking up small talk that felt like the prelude to something more. The first time he'd left a $100 tip, she'd thought it was a mistake. The second time, she'd hesitated before pocketing it. When the tip grew to $500, she knew it wasn't about generosity, it was about her. And she hated that. "So, Amelia," he said, his fingers tapping idly on the counter. "Any plans for the weekend?" She shrugged, her eyes fixed on the cup she was rinsing. "Just working. Same as always." "Come on," he coaxed, leaning in slightly. "You can't work all the time." "I need the money," she replied, her tone flat. A pause. Then, in a voice low and smooth, he said, "What if you didn't have to worry about that?" Her jaw tightened. She looked up at him, her eyes flaring with the frustration she tried to suppress for weeks. "I'm not for sale, Mr. Blackwood." His eyes flashed with something she couldn't quite name. Amusement, perhaps, or maybe something darker. "Everything has a price, Amelia," he said softly. "You just haven't heard the right number yet." A chill curled through her. She gripped the edge of the counter, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Enjoy your coffee." The bell above the door chimed again, and she turned away, desperate to put distance between them. She busied herself with the dishes, her hands shaking slightly. When she finally glanced back, he was gone, his coffee half finished, a crisp $50 bill left under the saucer. She stared at it for a long moment before shoving it into her apron pocket, resentment burning in her chest. She wanted to scream, to tell him that no amount of money could buy her dignity. But what was dignity when you were behind on rent, when your pantry held little more than dry pasta and canned soup? The bitterness of that thought twisted her stomach. The door jingled again, and she looked up, her heart sinking. Thomas was back. This time he wasn't alone. A man stood beside him, broad-shouldered and stern, dressed in a dark suit that seemed to absorb the light. There was a cold, calculating presence about him, a silent menace that set her nerves on edge. Thomas smiled, but there was something predatory about it now. He leaned on the counter, his eyes glinting. "Amelia," he said, his voice smooth and dangerous, "I have some news for you. I bought this café." Her breath stalled. The world tilted around her, the walls pressing in. He leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "We're going to be together, whether you like it or not." Her knees threatened to give way. She looked at the stranger beside him. A lawyer, she realized, the weight of his presence sinking like a stone in her gut. Thomas's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. "Everything," he whispered, "can be bought." Her world cracked open, the edges crumbling into something dark and unforgiving. The words hung in the air like a death knell. "I bought this café." They echoed through Amelia's mind, each syllable a hammer blow, shattering the fragile normalcy she'd fought to maintain. Her fingers dug into the counter, her knuckles white against the worn surface. Her voice felt trapped in her throat, but she forced it out, shaking with disbelief and anger. "You're lying." Thomas's smile didn't falter. If anything, it grew sharper, more serpentine. "The papers were signed this morning. It's all legal. This place, your place, is mine now." The man beside him, the one with the cold eyes and the air of ruthless authority, gave a curt nod. "I'm David Trent, Mr. Blackwood's attorney. If you need to see the documents, I have them right here." He held up a leather-bound folder, as if the physical proof of her loss would somehow make it easier to accept. The gesture, so formal and detached, felt like a slap to the face. She didn't need to see the papers. She could see the truth etched into Thomas's smug expression. Her vision blurred, tears of rage and helplessness welling up. How could this happen? The café might not have been much, but it was hers. A refuge from the relentless storms of life. A tiny pocket of control in a chaotic world. Now that was gone, snatched away with a few strokes of a pen. "You can't do this," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This is my job, my life." Thomas leaned in, his eyes glinting with a satisfaction that made her stomach turn. "I'm offering you more than just a job, Amelia. This doesn't have to be a bad thing. We can be together. You won't have to struggle anymore. No more late shifts, no more worrying about bills." His voice was silk over steel, each word winding around her like a chain. His gaze flickered with something possessive, something that chilled her to the core. "You'll have everything you need. All you have to do is say yes." The café felt smaller, the walls pressing in, suffocating her. Her co-workers, the few customers, they all seemed to fade into the background. This was a trap, and she was the only one who could see the bars closing around her. Her jaw clenched. "I already told you no." Thomas's eyes darkened, the veneer of charm slipping just a fraction. "And I told you, Amelia, everything has a price." Her hands trembled. She wanted to scream, to tear away the smug certainty on his face, but she knew it would be useless. He was the kind of man who bent the world to his will, who never heard the word no without finding a way around it. The lawyer, David, cleared his throat. "Mr. Blackwood expects professionalism from his employees. Should you choose not to cooperate, I'm sure you understand the consequences." The threat was implicit but clear as glass. Refuse, and she'd lose everything. Her job, her livelihood, the fragile stability she clung to. The rent was due in a week, and her savings were nearly gone. If she walked away now, she walked into uncertainty, into darkness. Thomas watched her, his eyes cold and calculating. He was giving her the illusion of choice, but they both knew she was cornered. Her voice trembled with controlled fury. "You think you own me now?" He smiled slowly, the cruelty of it barely hidden. "I don't need to own you, Amelia. I just need you to realize that we're better off together." She took a step back, the weight of his words suffocating her. Together. The word felt like a sentence, a life she didn't want but couldn't escape. The café, her refuge, now felt like a cage. Her thoughts spun wildly, her heart hammering. Fight or surrender, those were the only options left. And she knew, deep down, that surrender wasn't in her nature. Her lips curled into a bitter smile, tears glistening in her eyes. "You can own this cafe, Thomas. But you'll never own me." His expression faltered, a flicker of surprise and something darker. Disappointment, maybe even anger, crossing his face. She took that tiny victory, clutched it to her heart. "I quit," she said, the words tasting like freedom and terror all at once. She yanked off her apron and dropped it onto the counter. The room tilted as she turned on her heel, each step a battle against the panic clawing at her throat. The door was just a few feet away. She could still escape. But as her fingers grazed the handle, Thomas's voice, low and dangerous, stopped her in her tracks. "If you walk out now, Amelia, you'll regret it." Her knuckles went white around the handle. She didn't turn around. "I'd rather regret leaving than regret staying." And with that, she pushed the door open and stepped into the cold morning air. The wind slapped her cheeks, harsh and bracing, but it was better than the suffocating heat inside. Her heart pounded, adrenaline rushing through her veins. She'd done it. She'd escaped the trap. But as she walked away, each step pulling her further from the life she knew, a sick, cold dread settled in her stomach. She'd taken a stand, but at what cost? No job, no plan, no safety net. Behind her, the cafe door closed with a final heavy thud. And she knew Thomas Blackwood wasn't done with her yet. The cold wind bit into Amelia's skin as she walked briskly down the street, her breath forming clouds in the morning air. The world outside the cafe felt vast and indifferent, a sharp contrast to the oppressive control she'd just fled. Her heart still hammered in her chest, the adrenaline fading, leaving behind a hollow ache of fear and uncertainty. She forced herself to keep moving. Each step away from that cafe felt both liberating and terrifying. She had quit. She had taken control, but control of what? The realization slammed into her like a wave. No job, no income, rent due in a week. The edge of panic brushed against her thoughts, but she shoved it down, burying it beneath sheer determination. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a message from her landlord. Rent due in 5 days. No extensions. Her stomach twisted. She shoved the phone back into her coat pocket, her fingers trembling. She knew she needed to find another job, fast, but the weight of Thomas's influence loomed large in her mind. He was powerful. If he wanted to, he could ensure no one in the city hired her. Her feet carried her to a small park a few blocks away. The bare trees swayed in the wind, their skeletal branches clawing at the gray sky. She sank onto a weathered bench, the cold seeping through her jeans, and buried her face in her hands. The memory of Thomas's words echoed in her mind. "If you walk out now, Amelia, you'll regret it." What had she done? Was this bravery or foolishness? The line between the two felt so thin now. A soft voice jolted her out of her spiral of thoughts. "You okay, miss?" She looked up to see an elderly woman standing a few feet away, her eyes kind but sharp. A faded green coat hung loosely around her frail frame, and she leaned on a cane that looked as worn as the bench Amelia was sitting on. Amelia managed a faint smile. "I'll be okay," she murmured, though the words felt like a lie. The woman studied her for a moment, her gaze probing. Then she nodded and shuffled away, leaving Amelia alone with her thoughts once more. The wind picked up, rustling the dead leaves at her feet. A sudden sound behind her made her jump, the distinct crunch of footsteps on gravel. She turned quickly, her heart lurching. Thomas's lawyer, David Trent, stood just a few feet away. Amelia's breath caught in her throat. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice trembling. His expression was unreadable, his cold eyes giving nothing away. "Mr. Blackwood asked me to remind you of the opportunity you're walking away from." "Opportunity?" She laughed bitterly. "You mean the cage he wants to lock me in?" David's jaw tightened. "You have a week's notice to reconsider. If you don't, things will get difficult." She clenched her fists, fury bubbling beneath her fear. "Are you threatening me?" He shook his head, his voice measured. I'm giving you a chance to think carefully. Mr. Blackwood is not a man who likes unfinished business. She stood up, her legs shaky but resolute. I don't care what Thomas likes. I won't be his possession. David's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of something she couldn't identify passing over his face. Pity? Regret? But just as quickly, his expression returned to stone. Think it over, Amelia, he said quietly. You have until the end of the week. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the wind. Amelia sank back onto the bench, her mind a tangle of fear, anger, and uncertainty. Until the end of the week. The words throbbed in her mind like a countdown, each second ticking away her freedom. That night, her apartment felt colder than usual. The draft from the old windows whispered through the small living room, rattling the loose panes. She wrapped herself in a threadbare blanket and stared at the ceiling, her mind too restless to find sleep. Her phone lay on the coffee table, Thomas's number still saved under a name she hadn't been able to erase. Do not answer. She wondered what would happen if she called him, if she took the easy way out. A life without financial worry, without the constant pressure of survival. But it would come at the cost of her dignity, her freedom. Her fingers itched to delete his number, to sever the last thread tying her to him. But something held her back. A gnawing sense of unfinished business, of a story that hadn't yet reached its conclusion. There has to be a way out of this, she thought desperately. A soft knock at the door made her jump. She froze, her heart pounding. Who would be here at this hour? She tiptoed to the door, her breath shallow. Who is it? She called out, her voice shaking. Silence. She glanced through the peephole. The hallway was empty. A cold chill slithered down her spine. She double-locked the door, her fingers trembling, and backed away slowly. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, pressing in on her. The fear she had fought so hard to suppress came rushing back. Thomas wasn't going to let her go. Not without a fight. She sat on the couch, knees drawn to her chest, the darkness closing in. This wasn't over. And somehow she knew it was only going to get worse. Morning arrived with a grim grayness, the light barely breaking through the clouds outside Amelia's apartment window. She hadn't slept. The hours had been consumed by fear and the creeping sense that her life was spiraling out of control. Her eyes burned, heavy with exhaustion, but the adrenaline coursing through her veins kept her alert. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She flinched before snatching it up. An unknown number. Her fingers hovered over the answer button. Could it be Thomas? Another warning? The very thought made her stomach turn. With a shaky breath, she pressed accept and held the phone to her ear. Hello. There was a pause. Then a woman's voice, low and tense, broke through. Amelia Ward? Yes. Who is this? My name is Claire Bennett. I have information about Thomas Blackwood. We need to meet. Amelia's heart pounded in her chest. The name didn't ring any bells, but the urgency in the woman's voice was unmistakable. Why should I trust you? Amelia asked, suspicion thick in her tone. Because if you don't, you'll never get out from under Thomas's grip. I know what he's capable of, and I know how to stop him. Amelia's breath caught. Every instinct screamed to be cautious, but desperation gnawed at her resolve. This might be the only chance she had to fight back. Where do you want to meet? Greenwood Park, the bench near the old fountain. 30 minutes. The call ended abruptly. Amelia stared at her phone, her mind whirling. Who was Claire Bennett? And what did she know about Thomas? The wind had picked up by the time Amelia reached Greenwood Park. The skeletal trees swayed, their bare branches scraping the overcast sky. She hugged her coat tighter around her, scanning the area. The park was nearly empty, just a few joggers and dog walkers moving through the cold morning. Near the cracked and moss-covered fountain, a woman sat on a bench. Her auburn hair was pulled back into a tight ponytail, and her sharp eyes flicked up the moment Amelia approached. You're Amelia? The woman said, standing and extending a hand. I'm Claire. Amelia shook her hand briefly, noting the calluses on Claire's palm. This was a woman who knew hard work, someone who'd faced her own struggles. "Why are we here?" Amelia asked, cutting to the point. Claire's gaze was piercing. "Because Thomas Blackwood doesn't just want you, Amelia. He wants control. And he doesn't take no for an answer." "I figured that out already," Amelia said bitterly. Claire nodded. "He did the same to me. Different place, different job, but the same story. He doesn't believe people can say no to him, and when they do, he makes sure they regret it." Amelia's blood ran cold. "What happened to you?" Claire's jaw clenched, and she looked away, her eyes darkening with memories. "I was a paralegal at a firm he worked with. He took an interest in me the way he takes an interest in anything he thinks he can own. When I refused him, things went downhill fast. I lost my job. My reputation was ruined. He made my life hell." Amelia swallowed hard, dread pooling in her stomach. "Why didn't you go to the police?" "Thomas covers his tracks too well. He has friends in high places. Any complaint I made disappeared before it saw daylight." Claire's eyes met Amelia's, fierce and unyielding. "But I've spent the last year gathering evidence. Proof of the things he's done, not just to me but to others. Financial fraud, blackmail, coercion. He's not untouchable, Amelia. He just thinks he is." Hope, fragile and dangerous, sparked in Amelia's chest. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're the first person to stand up to him since me. And he's making the same moves he made with me." Claire took a deep breath. "I want to take him down, but I can't do it alone. I need someone who's willing to fight with me." Amelia's mind spun. The fear, the hopelessness. It all fought against the surge of determination rising within her. Thomas had taken her job, threatened her freedom, and tried to buy her dignity. And if Claire was right, he'd done far worse to others. She clenched her fists, her nails biting into her palms. "What do you need me to do?" Claire's lips curved into a grim smile. "We're going to expose him, publicly, but we need to get him to reveal his true nature. We need a confrontation. One that can't be swept under the rug." Amelia's heart thudded. "You want me to bait him?" Claire nodded. "It's dangerous, but if we can get him to threaten you, coerce you on record, it'll be the leverage we need." A chill crawled up Amelia's spine. The thought of facing Thomas again made her stomach twist. But the alternative, living under his shadow, always looking over her shoulder, was worse. She took a shaky breath. "Okay, I'll do it." Claire placed a hand on her shoulder, her grip firm. "You're brave, Amelia. Braver than you know." Amelia's eyes burned, but she blinked away the tears. She wasn't brave. She was desperate. But maybe, just maybe, desperation was enough to tip the scales. "Let's end this," she whispered. As they walked away from the bench, the wind howled through the trees, carrying with it the scent of rain and the promise of a storm. And for the first time, Amelia felt ready to face it. The sky hung heavy with clouds, a leaden dome pressing down on the city as if it knew a storm was coming. The kind that wasn't made of wind or rain. Amelia's nerves buzzed like live wires as she sat in her apartment, Claire beside her, the weight of their plan coiling tightly around them. On the coffee table, a small recording device sat like a loaded gun. It was cheap, barely bigger than a matchbox, but its purpose was clear. Capture the truth. Expose Thomas Blackwood for what he was. Amelia's hands shook as she picked it up. "What if this doesn't work?" she whispered. "What if he sees right through me?" Claire's eyes, steely and resolute, met hers. "He won't. Men like Thomas think they're invincible. They're so used to getting what they want, they don't believe anyone can outsmart them. That's his weakness." Amelia swallowed hard. The idea of confronting Thomas made her stomach twist, but she'd made her choice. She couldn't live in fear. Not anymore. The plan was simple in theory but dangerous in practice. She would meet Thomas, pretend to reconsider his offer, and get him to reveal his true colors, to say something damning, something that couldn't be explained away. Claire would be nearby, recording everything. Amelia's phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a message from Thomas. "Dinner, 7 p.m. Lujardin. Don't be late." She stared at the words, dread pooling in her stomach. His confidence dripped from each syllable. He was so sure she'd come crawling back. Lou Jardin, Claire murmured, leaning over to read the message. That's a power move. It's one of the fanciest restaurants in the city. He wants you to feel small, like you owe him something. Amelia's jaw tightened. Not this time. Claire nodded. Remember, you're in control. No matter what he says, no matter how he tries to twist things, stick to the plan. Get him to talk. Amelia exhaled shakily. Okay, let's do this. The restaurant gleamed like a jewel, its polished windows reflecting the amber glow of streetlights. Inside, crystal chandeliers sparkled above white linen tables, the low hum of conversation weaving a tapestry of wealth and privilege. Amelia stepped inside, her worn coat and scuffed boots a stark contrast to the glittering elegance. She felt the eyes of patrons flicking toward her, judgments disguised as fleeting glances. She clenched her fists, resisting the urge to shrink back. Tonight, she wouldn't let appearances define her worth. A host greeted her with a practiced smile, his gaze barely masking his skepticism. May I help you? I'm meeting Thomas Blackwood, she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. His eyes widened slightly before he nodded. Right this way. The walk to the private dining room felt like a gauntlet. Each step echoed in her ears, her heart pounding harder with every breath. The door at the end of the hall loomed large, a portal to a confrontation she both dreaded and needed. The host opened the door, and there he was. Thomas sat at a table set for two, his tailored suit impeccable, a glass of red wine in his hand. He looked up and smiled, the kind of smile that once might have seemed charming but now felt like the glint of a blade. Amelia, he said smoothly, rising to his feet. You came. She forced a tight smile. I did. He gestured to the chair opposite him. Sit. Let's talk. She slid into the seat, her palms damp, the tiny recording device nestled in her pocket. Claire was outside, waiting, ready. Amelia drew in a deep breath, reminding herself of the stakes. Thomas watched her, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to read her thoughts. I knew you'd reconsider. She met his gaze, forcing steel into her spine. Maybe I just want to understand what you really want from me. He smiled, but there was a chill behind it. I've been clear, haven't I? I want you by my side. You'll have everything you need. No more struggles. No more worries. Her voice trembled, but she pressed on. And what if I say no again? His jaw tightened ever so slightly. Why would you? I own this cafe now, Amelia. I can make life very difficult for you. There it was, the edge of the trap. She pushed gently. Difficult how? He leaned in, his voice low and dangerous. I can make sure you never work in this city again. Your name blacklisted, your reputation ruined. Everything you think you own, everything you've worked for, I can take it away. All you have to do is say yes, and none of that happens. A cold dread coiled in her stomach. His eyes glittered with the satisfaction of a man who believed he had already won. Amelia swallowed, the weight of his threat pressing on her chest. But she forced herself to ask, and if I refuse? His smile vanished. Then you'll lose everything. Her fingers curled into fists beneath the table. That's it. That's the truth we need. She stared into his eyes, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. You can take my job, Thomas. You can take everything I own. But you'll never own me. A muscle in his jaw twitched. He leaned back, his gaze hardening. You're making a mistake. No, she said, rising to her feet, her heart thundering. The mistake was ever letting you think I could be bought. He opened his mouth to respond, but she didn't wait. She turned and walked away, her legs shaky but determined. She pushed open the door, stepping into the cool night air where Claire waited, eyes wide with anticipation. Did you get it? Amelia asked, her voice trembling. Claire nodded, holding up the recorder. Every word. Relief and fear tangled in Amelia's chest. The truth was captured. The world would finally see Thomas Blackwood for what he was. But as they hurried away from the restaurant, a dark certainty gnawed at her. This wasn't over, and she knew Thomas wouldn't go down without a fight. The night air was sharp and electric, stinging Amelia's cheeks as she and Claire hurried down the quiet streets. The weight of the recording in Claire's pocket felt both reassuring and ominous. They had what they needed, Thomas's threats laid bare, his arrogance caught in cold, undeniable words. But the exhilaration of that small victory was shadowed by the chilling certainty that Thomas wouldn't let this stand. They ducked into Claire's car, the door locks clicking shut like a shield. Amelia exhaled, her breath shaking, her heart a storm in her chest. "We have it," she whispered, more to herself than to Claire. "We actually have it." Claire nodded, her fingers tight on the wheel. "Now we take it to the media. We go public. Once this is out there, he won't be able to silence us." Amelia's stomach knotted. The thought of her face on the news, of being thrust into the public eye, filled her with dread. But it was the only way. The truth needed to be bigger than Thomas's power. "Do you know someone who'll run it?" Amelia asked. "Yes," Claire replied. "An old friend of mine works for the Herald. She's been waiting for something concrete to take him down." Amelia nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then let's do it." By morning, the city buzzed with the news. Local millionaire exposed in coercion scandal. Threats and power plays. The real Thomas Blackwood. Whistleblowers reveal dark truth behind wealthy businessman. The headlines screamed from newsstands and blared on screens. The recording of Thomas's threats played on repeat. His cold, confident voice promising to ruin Amelia's life. The image of his arrogance, laid bare for everyone to see, shattered his pristine reputation like glass. Amelia sat at Claire's kitchen table, a cup of untouched coffee in front of her. Her phone buzzed constantly. Reporters, acquaintances, people she hadn't heard from in years. But the message she dreaded most still hadn't come. Thomas's silence was louder than any threat. Claire paced the room, her energy restless. "He's quiet. Too quiet." Amelia's fingers tapped against the ceramic mug. "He's planning something. He won't let this go." As if summoned by her words, her phone lit up with a message. "Unknown number. You think this is over? You've made a mistake you can't undo." Her blood turned to ice. She showed the screen to Claire, whose jaw clenched with fury. "That coward," Claire muttered. "He's trying to scare you." Amelia swallowed, fear coiling tight in her chest. "It's working." Claire grabbed her hand, her grip firm. "We've come too far to back down now. He's losing control and he knows it. That's why he's threatening you." Amelia nodded, though the fear didn't ease. "What if he does more than threaten?" Claire's eyes darkened. "Then we fight harder." A sudden knock at the door made them both jump. Claire grabbed a kitchen knife, holding it low as she approached the door. She peered through the peephole, then relaxed. "It's a woman, middle-aged, looks nervous." Claire opened the door cautiously. A woman with graying hair and weary eyes stepped inside, clutching a worn purse. She looked around, her gaze settling on Amelia. "Are you Amelia Ward?" Her voice trembled. "Yes," Amelia said, confused. The woman's eyes filled with tears. "My name is Margaret Blackwood. I'm Thomas's mother." Amelia's breath caught. The room tilted slightly. His mother? Margaret's voice shook. "I saw the news. I heard the recording. And I knew I had to come." Claire narrowed her eyes. "Why are you here?" Margaret's gaze flicked to her, then back to Amelia. "Because I need you to know the truth. Thomas hasn't always been like this. He wasn't born a monster. He was made into one." Amelia's chest tightened. "What do you mean?" Margaret's shoulders slumped. "My husband, Thomas's father, was a cruel man. He believed power was everything. He taught Thomas that kindness was weakness, that people were either tools or obstacles. I tried to protect him, to teach him differently, but..." Her voice broke. "I failed. When his father died, Thomas inherited everything. The money, the company, the toxic beliefs." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I'm not here to excuse him. I know what he's done is wrong. But I wanted you to know that beneath all of this, there was once a boy who just wanted to be loved. A boy who was never allowed to be vulnerable." Amelia's heart ached. a confusing mix of anger and pity swirling inside her. "Why are you telling me this now?" Margaret looked at her with pleading eyes. "Because you might be the only one who can stop him. If you confront him with the truth about his father's legacy, maybe you can break the cycle." Claire's voice was cold. "You think he can be redeemed after everything he's done?" Margaret shook her head. "I don't know. But if you don't try, he'll destroy you, and himself." Amelia's hands shook. The thought of facing Thomas again, armed with the truth of his pain, felt unbearable. But something in her heart whispered that this was the only way to end it. Not with revenge, but with a chance, however small, for redemption. She nodded slowly. "Where can I find him?" Margaret's eyes glistened. "He'll be at his father's old estate tonight. He always goes there when he feels like he's losing control." Claire grabbed Amelia's hand. "You don't have to do this." But Amelia knew she did. This has to end. One way or another. The estate loomed before her, dark and imposing. She stepped through the wrought iron gates, her heart pounding. Thomas stood on the balcony, his figure etched against the stormy sky. He turned, surprise flashing in his eyes. "You shouldn't be here." She met his gaze, her voice steady. "Neither should you." The wind whipped around them, carrying away the illusions. In that moment, it wasn't a battle of power, but two broken souls standing on the edge of ruin. "You can't buy everything, Thomas," she said softly. "Not love, not redemption, not me." His face crumpled, years of bitterness cracking. For the first time, she saw the boy his mother spoke of, lost, afraid, and alone. The storm broke, rain falling like tears, and for the first time Thomas didn't try to stop it.